We're looking at the Dynasty Fantasy Football trade market. We're looking at some of these players who are getting dumped over at Keep Trade Cut to see whether you want to buy, sell, or trade them. These players are being sold potentially in leagues right now. The market sentiment is lowering. We're going to look at these players, see what to do with them, look at the values, project out their values going forward throughout the offseason, start of the season, maybe even in season, to see what you want to do in the future even. But before we dig in, you need to click that subscribe button right now. We're looking at the market for Dynasty Fantasy Football every day. We're looking at the rookies. We're helping you build your fantasy teams. It's all right here. It's every day, a la carte style. Just pick the videos you want and roll with it. Click that button. Stop missing out. But the first player we're looking at today, the market's hitting them hard. It's really not the player's fault, but again, the market's the market, and you got to read it and you got to react however you need to react to it. It's Tank Dell. Tank Dell had a really bad injury, and now we do not know if he's going to be back in 2025 or when he's going to be back in 2025. We also look at the production of last year, and it was so-so. It was so-so. It did not live up to the potential of where he was getting drafted at. However, we knew going into the season with Stephon Diggs in the mix, with Nico Collins getting a huge target share, that it's going to be a little bit harder for him to be consistent in fantasy football. That's what we saw here. We saw a wide receiver with 2 wide receiver 2 weeks, 1 wide receiver 1 week. And that being said, a lot of wide receiver weeks in the wide receiver 30 plus range. When it comes to targets, there was a lot of games where we were all right, where we were at the 5+ range in targets. However, we did have some down games. We had about 7 games where we were at 4 targets or below, but we had a fair amount of matchups where we were able to hit that threshold. However, we did not hit double-digit targets in a game this season. In his rookie season, we did that multiple times. We did it 4 times as a rookie in less games. The market has dumped him to wide receiver 43, and it's been a sharp dump since the injury. So we're looking at an injury prognosis here of the stock market here for Dynasty Fantasy Football. When we're looking at his advanced stats here, we're looking at the air yards and his opportunity. We're looking at a guy that was getting 18% target share and getting an ADOT of 12.5. The ADOT of 12.5 ranks 25th among wide receivers, so we were getting deep targets downfield, we were getting good volume, but we were not able to cash on that. Our catchable target rate ranked 62nd among wide receivers, and that makes sense. Deeper targets, higher acuity rates, harder to bring those in. You also got Nico Collins downfield, you got Stephon Diggs getting some of that underneath work as well. That being said, Tank Dell, with some better targets coming his way, getting deeper targets downfield, is something to look at. 18.1% target share isn't super sexy though. It's just not, because you want your wide receivers that you're banking on to get a 20+% target share, because they're going to be more stable week to week. 18.1% target share with a 12.5% ADOT just screams that you're going to be up and down. That's what we saw here in the production. A good route participation rate on the season at 81.2%. So we were on the field, we were running a lot of routes, we were getting a lot of opportunities, and we were running about 30 routes a game. That is solid, that is good work, so the workload was there. However, we don't know when he's going to be back. It could be late next season, it could be in 2026. I look for the market to drop him a little bit more. I look for that to happen. Earlier this year, he was wide receiver 18, he's dropped the wide receiver 43. I think there's going to be a time, because it's going to take him some time to get back from this injury, that he's going to become a forgotten player, that you can catch him on the cheap if you're looking to get him later. And even when you're getting him later, you don't have to have the same expectations. You could have the expectations of like wide receiver 40 range, a guy that you're using as a patch-up player week to week, because you're going to be buying him at a cheaper price tag. But if I have him, and I like them, and I know what I got, I might not be too liquid with them on the market, so you may not be able to get the deal done, but I could see you getting him cheaper on the market later. I could definitely see that happening, especially when we infuse more rookies, when mainstream gets deeper into rookie talk, when people start looking at their leagues more. I could definitely see him getting cheaper, especially once we get to the start of the season, and if he's not out there in training camp, if he's not out there practicing, if he's not out there week 1, 2, 3, 4, you're going to see a little nosedive. And if you're interested in getting him, that would be the time. I think he would be a little cheaper, a fair amount cheaper than that. I know a lot of people, whenever a trade like this happens, they'll be looking to sell too to get whatever they can get, because they do not want that asset on the roster, and they'd rather have something there where they can get points out of. So when you're looking at the adjacent players, one for one, some of these are going to be hard to do, but like a Jacoby Myers, Tajay Spears, Travis Etienne that far, I look for him to drop past that point. I look for you to have to go a little bit more down on the rankings. I do not see that in real trade scenarios being too liquid. So I argue against the keep, trade, cut data there, but it's a good starting point to look at. I don't know about kicking the tires, but the rule of thumb here on this channel, I don't know anywhere else, that when you see a big market change on a player, down, up, sideways, I don't care. You kick the tires and see what happens. If you're not interested in the player, then don't. But if you're somewhat interested, if you want to see if you can get a value there, tank down. I see that trend line dropping a little bit more. And if not, I see him being a little bit more liquid in the future. So if you want to explore that, you might get a better success rate trying to buy on the low in the future. If you're looking to sell, I do not see him being too liquid with the players that are being mentioned by Keep Trade Cut here. But I do look for you to try and get something for week 1, 2, and 3 to feel good about, or get you a pick going into the draft. I do not expect the picks to be too liquid for an injured wide receiver that wasn't super productive this year, that kind of tanked in production. And honestly, his production's matching his ranking in the wide receiver chart down there. So that being said, you're probably not going to get much at you. Back in second, third, mid-third, something like that. You're going to get something where you're probably just going to think about holding on. I do not think you're going to get something back at you that you're going to be too happy about, unless you're just trying to get rid of them. But if you got the spot to hold them for a year, maybe you do that to see what happens. When I look at the Houston Texans in mock drafts, the wide receiver well is usually zapped up and dry. So they're going to have to reach or trade up to get a wide receiver in the draft. So if they're looking to add talent, free agency is probably the route to go. That is probably what they're going to look at. Stephon Diggs, they got to look at his deal. Deontay Johnson they brought in. He has not been great recently, but he's been moving around some teams. There's some options for this team for them to look at going into the offseason, but this is a team you want to pay attention to. The next player we're looking at here is Joe Mixon. Joe Mixon, per Keep Trade Cut, has dropped on the market. He's dropped a fair bit, mainly because of that horrid run in fantasy from weeks 15 to 18. He just killed fantasy gamers. That's a sour taste in their mouth right now. Not looking good, but throughout the season, multiple RB1 weeks, opportunity share was up. His opportunity share dipped from weeks 15 to 18 too, from 18 to 6. It just dropped, and we had some injuries baked in there, so that compiled. On top of that, we're a veteran running back in the back leg of the season. So we're going to be going into the 2025 season, rejuvenate a little bit, and if I had to guess his scoring chart for the Texans, it's probably going to be similar to this, where he might miss a few games, he might have some down stretches, he's going to have some up games going into the season. Some people are going to be saying, hey, he's a sell, and then next thing you know, 4 or 5 RB1 weeks, and then followed up with 4 or 5 RB3 plus weeks. That's probably what's going to happen, and he'll probably finish off like 15 points per game or something like that. 17.2 this year, if I had to guess. And the downturn will probably happen eventually, but when we look at his contract and stuff here, he's got some time with the Texans, potential out after next year. So in 2025, they're going to ride him out. At age 29, there is potential for a dip, and that could happen. That down run we saw could leak into next year. There's a chance, and it could leak like sooner. It could leak longer. That could happen. It could happen like back half of the season. Maybe instead of like 4 or 5 games, it could be like 6, 7, 8, and it's in the back 9 of the season. You never know. However, the market's dropping him, but when we look at the market here and his efficiency ratings, his efficiency wasn't too bad. He got a lot of opportunity. 5th among running backs in opportunity share. That's really what I'm looking at week to week when I'm looking at these running backs. He's running a lot of routes. He's running 12.1 routes per game and a 34.2% route participation rate. His yards after contact per attempt actually increased this year. Had 45 missed tackles compared to the previous years with the Bengals. So actually we saw an increase in some of his work rate. 31 carries of 10 plus yards. That's something to look at. But he was valued as RB12 going into November, and then all of a sudden, landslide in the fantasy production, and we saw it drop. So when I'm trying to predict his fantasy value, I see it increasing once we get closer to the start of the season. I see that jumping up a bit. I could also see this team bringing in a running back in the draft, maybe at a cheaper rate, maybe middle rounds, later rounds. It's a deeper class. I could definitely see that so they can get depth just in case he's out for some time next year and really preparing for the days they do not have Joe Mixon anymore. That is in line for that. That could happen. This is a good draft class to do that. All running back classes that's deep is good for all teams, honestly, because of how the league is ran at the running back position. All running backs could get landmined. Joe Mixon could have that happen, and that could really impact his value. But if it doesn't, I look for his stock to rise a little bit going into the season. RB12 at the high, RB25 actually at its lowest point, RB19 right now. That being said, it's been taking a dive as of lately on Keep Trade Cut, and the market sentiment saying, hey, we don't like how he ended the season. If you're playing running back in 1-year windows and you're competing for next year, I wouldn't care too much if I'm catching him at RB19 to RB25 price points, because the opportunity share was top 5 and likely healthy on the field, which is unpredictable, but we know the odds are increasing by the minute with him. That is something to look at. RB19, RB25 price range. I look for his price tag to boost as we get closer to the start of the season, once we get past training camp. However, there's a chance that they draft the running back, and if they draft the running back, I don't see significant draft capital, but it could be a guy that could be a good spell, that could be a good guy for the future for this team that they're going to have sit for a year and watch, kind of like some other teams did. Like we're looking at Trey Benson and James Conner. We're looking at Blake Corum and Kyron Williams. Kind of like getting your other running back and letting them watch, letting them hang out. And you know when your starter goes down, you got a good quality backup there that could be a starter in the future as well. So you got that investment with those 2 running backs. That's something that could happen there, especially at this point, especially when you saw that scoring run with Joe Mixon. I think a good time to buy is either just trying to get it done right now, maybe in season and just paying up. That way you know he's unscathed and you're paying a little bit more, but you know what you're getting, but you know the downturn's going to come somewhere down the line, but you're trying to win it, and you know you're in it to win it. You know you're good to go, so you're putting your chips in. Another thing is after the draft, even if they draft the running back, and more likely if they draft that running back, because chances are they're going to allow him to get that opportunity share. It's going to be up, and things aren't going to change unless something changes with Joe Mixon, and it's really going to be the same path for 2025, whether that running back's there or not, because if Joe Mixon's there, it's whether he falls down or not, and that could happen week 1, week 16, you're never going to know. George Pickens has been taking a big hit on the market, and there's a lot of down sentiment on him. He was a little bit truthful, or a little bit him in the media. Maybe that's more of the correct way of saying it. when you go back and look at his season, very volatile. And hitting the top end an okay amount of the times, 2 20-point weeks, 18-pointer, 16-pointer, another 16-pointer, and a 13-pointer. After that, it's a lot of yuck. However, that's what you would expect from a guy that's getting a large target share on the Steelers with bad quarterback play. That's something you would expect. We got 2 wide receiver 1 weeks on the season. We're still valued at wide receiver 21. In the last 16 months, he was at his highest at wide receiver 13 and his lowest at wide receiver 35. If you notice the chart below me and you're looking at market sentiment, you will notice that the market will take dumps on him periodically. Just periodically. You'll notice the chart be like this. Drop, then back up. Drop, back up. And now we're doing another drop. So I look for his value to go back up because he hasn't proven anything different than what he's shown us, honestly. He hasn't proven that. Whether the point you want to buy or sell is different, but I look for that to happen, that up and down. And when I see that, and I look at the 11.9 points per game, I look at the volatility, that is very high-priced volatility. I'll definitely say that. You can probably catch that at a cheaper price point. You look at some of those wide receivers that are getting a lot of deep targets that are very up and down that you can look at. Rashad Bateman's cheaper, and you're going to get similar numbers, and you can catch him in a pick or something like that. You can catch a lot of wide receivers like this who are getting similar amount of air yards, pushing it downfield, and you get similar production. George Pickens makes you feel safe at night because you know the target share is going to be there at around 25%. You know the volume is going to be there. He's going to be steady, but his targets aren't very catchable. Ranked 71st in the league among wide receiver. That ain't really going to change unless he goes to a different team. There's a chance of that. He's not going to be with the Steelers too much longer unless they re-up his contract. They're probably going to be looking to the market if they don't want to re-sign him. They're probably not. And from what we're seeing, from reading the tea leaves from social media, from what he's saying in the media and everything else, we got a good ADOT of 13.6. We're leading the team in targets. We're getting good volume. Still just 900 yards and 3 touchdowns to his name. And you can catch that production in fantasy cheaper than compared to his lower market rate even. But that's going to go up. So are you looking to sell, buy, hold to see what happens, or if he goes to a different team? Because if he goes to a different team, that target share, 26.5%, should get reduced. It's hard to stay that way unless you're going to be the bona fide wide receiver 1. And you're looking at a lot of teams here in the National Football League. There's a lot of competition. You're looking at his positional rank. You're looking at him versus a bunch of other wide receivers here. You can get Chris Olave, Jameson Williams, Jalen Waddle. There's a lot of other wide receivers, and a lot of them are not liquid with him, tradable for him in actual real leagues, but it's a gauge. It's a market gauge. The most this tells you is that the market overall, the feeling sentiment of this player here is dropping, and on average, it will drop harshly, then rise back up within a few weeks. So that's what we're probably going to see with George Pickens, is the market's going to get back to him sooner than later. So do not worry about it. I would not be worrying about it on the market. I would not care too much. I think over the course of the offseason, I think it's going to be holding steady, if not rising back up. I think from wide receiver 21 to wide receiver 13, I'd be around like 15, 18-ish. I don't think that really matters. I don't think I really care between 21 and 13 in that range anyways. I think I'm just going to moneyball the price tags in my deals. I'm not really looking to get him. I would only look to get him if I'm getting him cheap. I would only look at him if I'm getting him cheaper than market rate. I just do not see right now in this situation him getting steady catchable targets. I do look for him to get value. I do look for him week to week to get 5+ targets a game. And that is something when you're setting lineups, something you like. Something you like. Good air yards, deep targets, you throw them in there, you close your eyes, you pray to the fantasy gods. That is one thing. In season is different than going back and looking at the spreadsheets. That is one thing I can say about George Pickens in his 2024 season. That When you had them in your lineup, you knew you were going to get targets, and you knew they were going to be deep downfield, and you knew they were splash play potential. So you're looking at those targets, and you're just praying to the fantasy gods that they hit. And off and on, they would. Off and on. Some days they wouldn't, and it'd be dreadful, and then other days they would. That's the thing about George Pickens. You just throw him in there, and you pray to the fantasy gods, and maybe you want that. Maybe you want that because his consistency on the upside wasn't too horrible for a volatile wide receiver. I just think for a volatile wide receiver 21 is kind of high up there, and then you're pushing the market sentiment to go up. So I expect that to be a little bit high for that when you can always find wide receivers at a cheaper cost. However, the name, the value that stays stable there over the course of time, you do not expect it to tank unless something really bad happens. So you may like that a little bit more. I do not see him being too liquid on the market. I think if I'm trying to buy, I would try to swoop in right now while the market's negative and just try to get it done. If I'm looking to sell, I think you're going to have a better chance after the draft. There's a chance that the Steelers go wide receiver, but when you're looking at mock drafts and the value, it's really hard seeing a wide receiver going their way unless like an Emeka Egbuka falls or they catch somebody in free agency. It's not a deep wide receiver class, so the odds of some of these wide receivers getting zapped is harsh. It's hard to see happening. George Pickens, relatively safe as long as he's on this team. We'll see what happens with that. A lot of people speculating on social media about that, but he's also George Pickens, and he's done a lot of crazy things out there in the media. Those are three players that we're looking at today, all over the place, and the takes are all over the place. They're not really takes. It's just me seeing the information and relaying it so you can make your decisions. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Make sure to hit that subscribe button on the way out. One thing for watching. Catch you on the next video.